Hello, everybody. My name's Thomas Fracken. This is the Roundtable Chats podcast, episode 8. I'm going to be interviewing Mr. Dexter Sumner. Dexter is a social science researcher, and he's also a hardware IT systems coordinator at the World Resource Institute. Dexter, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hey, my pleasure.
So, a question I always like to start with is what are you grateful for?
Dancing.
And
It's one
why
of the
is that?
greatest it's one of the greatest forms of self-expression ever. Yep.
I was just no, I was just reminded of how I connected with you in the first place on LinkedIn, and you were just striking such a great pose. And I know that's five rhythms. Could you go into more depth about your journey with dancing and what that's been like for you, and just the story behind that a little bit?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the photograph. It's
Yeah.
I'm attempting to do, despite my knees screaming at me, the classic Shiva dance. The woman who's sort of like twists her body at the same time she bends her knees in sort of like a Hindu Buddhism practice,
Mm.
and it's called a Shiva dancer. And I was attempting to do that. And it's one of the postures I do when I do wave dancing, which is a meditative form of dancing. And five rhythm is interesting social event where dance is broken into waves. And sometimes
Mm.
it's called wave dancing, sometimes it's called ecstatic dancing. But each rhythm is there for you to move through, to help still the mind,
Mm.
and to find new awareness in who you are. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And how were you first exposed to five rhythms? How did you first learn about it?
Um, well, I was always into dance, but it came about mostly from a few of my colleagues there and I who practice yoga. They had sort of like introduced me into the concept, and it was really funny because I'm thinking, first time I did it, it's five rhythms, so I'm gonna hear five rhythms, and then that's it, and I'm out of there. And actually, five rhythms is sort of like a figurative, sort of like glimpse at the five rhythms, types of rhythms you're going to hear during the 2 hours of meditative moving, right?
Mm.
So half an hour into it, I'm listening to all these, types of music that enhance the wave, and I'm thinking,
Right.
well, this isn't five rhythms. This is 5,000 rhythms. Why do they call it five rhythms? So that was my sort of like first, I would say, sort of like serendipitous thought for five
Mm.
rhythms. And after I got into it, it really worked. It's really great. So yeah,
Yeah, and how long have you been doing this type of dancing? How much
I've
experience
been
do you have?
doing it for about a year now,
Okay.
and yeah. There's a whole like science or like um, sort of like concept behind it, as far as a social aspect in thinking and different ways of thinking. And it was, I guess, brought about by a woman named Gabriella Roth in New
Mm.
York, and they called it the shaman of New York. And so, yeah, there's a whole science behind it. And one of the things that's kind of cool, I think your listeners would enjoy with five rhythms, is that Gabriella Roth used to say, we have all these mental inertias or baggages with
Mm.
us in our personality that were just brought through us to this like incredibly rough world we live in.
Right.
Right?
Sure.
So the idea is that while you're moving through the rhythms, you're releasing or getting rid of all this mental baggage that you've
Mm.
had for all your life. And through that, there's healing.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you felt a difference in how you operate in the world and how you feel day to day? I mean, since you've been doing that for a year, have you noticed any changes in your body or in your routine or even how you view the world and think?
Definitely. Personality wise, definitely. I think also any sort of like practice, meditative practice like that, it's been shown to grow neurons in the
Mm.
mind. And when you have more neurons, your cognition is better, or your cognitive perception is much better. And I've seen that in me all the time.
Right.
So I continue to do it. But I think for a lot of people, like it's a new sort of like astonishing thing, a new sort of like understanding. But for me, it wasn't too, and some people, it's hard for them to cross into it. But for me, it wasn't too bad because I think dancing and physical movements have always been part of my life. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And yeah, I want to go dive deeper into the background of your life and your life story a little bit. And as many or a few words as you would like to share, what is your life story? Who is Dexter Sumner?
Oh, it's easy. It's rated R for ridiculous. Okay, so like let's make this like the short version before everybody goes to sleep, right?
Yeah.
So originally I'm Canadian.
Right.
Via West Indian heritage, and I grew up in the city of Toronto, and sort of like came here at a teenage with my parents, which is the worst time to come. And so from there I was really into, I would say, again, this goes maybe with the 5 rhythms. I was big into music. That seemed to really work for me, and for some strange reason, I don't know why, but from an early age, I was really good at history and social perception, you know? And that sort of led to me when I started going to universities, I started concentrating on Earth. Well, I was originally concentrating on earth sciences, but that kind of bled into this whole international perspective type of thing, international relations. And it through that whole, the sort of like the study, I would say from within a span of maybe 5-6 years from starting out in earth science, it sort of blossomed into, why do we do these things that we do in a social life? And why is it that some of the things we do today, back, I don't know, a century ago, was a complete abomination, right? So like we see there are things we do today that we look back in history, we say we would never do them, but people at that time did them, and they were quite normal.
Yeah.
Right. And so I found myself when I lived in Europe for a bit, and I decided to write a paper on the International Criminal Court when there, and it was just a self-initiated paper. It's online. It's only 7 pages, so anybody can read it. But the International Criminal Court came about because of the constant occurrence of genocide, right? Even after World War II, it occurred another 4 times. And so the International Criminal Court, which came about physically in the 1990s, is the world saying, maybe we should have some sort of institution that quickly identifies it and puts a stop on it before it occurs again, right? And from that research I was looking into it, I began to look at all these other horridities human beings have done to each other. And it fascinated me, right? And so it seemed to me like the more things we did that were worse than anything we've ever done before, the more I was interested in it.
Right.
Well, yeah, so everybody says something about your childhood, right? I'm like, yeah, growing up in Canada with those winters are pretty rough. Yeah. So it's like, that's how this whole thing I really got deep into social science and began to look at it, because the thing was most interested me is that I saw in my time in my research that there were like 3 or 4 events where we really shouldn't have survived, but we made it. Right. And all of that connected to me with certain formats, certain types of events in history. You can see them intersecting, where they combine, disease and war, sickness and natural disasters.
Right.
And I mean, think about something like this, right? Now, this is really strange. Think about this. We live in a world where each mammal species that are, I guess, related to us, so we're all, mammals, and then you have fish, and then you have birds, and you have, et cetera, et cetera. There are roughly 5 or 6 types of human beings, right? But if you look in the animal world for each species, there's 1 trillion of them. So like, let's take an example for like bears. You can find 10 or 15 different types of bears.
Right. Yeah.
Sharks, who are just fish, who are not mammals, there are 200 different types of fish. 200 different types of sharks, just the species alone, right? And then we were talking about my dog earlier, right? How many types of dogs are there? I don't know, 45, 50, you know?
Probably more than
No
that,
one can
yeah.
name them all, right? Yeah, but there's only 5 or 6 of us. That tells me, but again, that tells me something went weird, because scientists tells us, or science, the study of anthropology, tells us that at some point in time there were 15 types of human beings.
Mm.
And today we have like roughly 6. That says something happened.
Right, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot that needs to be accounted for, yeah.
And then it goes back to this thing, well, something happened. How did we make it through it? And so those are the things that interest me.
Yeah, absolutely. And where does that take you now, that kind of research and looking into these cataclysmic events and things like that? What has happened since then, since you realized you have this curiosity and this fascination with the subject?
That led me to do some, when I came back to the States, do some sort of like local political work, and to get together with groups that are concerned with ecological concerns. And so I had spent some years on boats doing studies, and then also with some groups here in Washington, D.C. doing research. But it poignantly all led me to one of the things that initially became part of my synopsis on the International Criminal Court, and that was World War I. And that's sort of like, that has led to the main focus of sort of like my background with science, and like, why do we do the things we do, and why do we do the things that are horrible for us, even though we know they're horrible going in. We still do them.
We still do it.
So then that is sort of like today where a lot of the work I've done through, I formed a sort of like freelance group I call the Hague Files, which is named after the Hague in the Netherlands, and that's where I had done my research on the International Criminal Court and the paper. And so through that, I began looking at some issues, and sort of like at the same time looking at what we now call the Great War, which was originally called the Great War until World War II came around. And I found the Great War to be the most fascinating thing that I've ever researched, and it's incredible. And as I remember we were talking, that there are things that came from it that are still with us today, so it shows the impact.
Right. What kind of things are still with us today from World War I?
Right. So you would think I would go into these military types of things, right? Machine guns, bunkers, barbed wire, and all that. But actually, the things that came from the Great War that are with us, that have nothing to do with war itself at all. Right? And we just don't know. And we don't know. And some of them we do regularly, and no one knows it comes from the Great War. So it's really interesting. So your question is, what types of things?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I'll give you 3 or 4 of them, because I'm going to do a presentation on this too. So
okay.
I don't want to give away all the beans.
You're right.
Here.
Yeah, I understand.
The major ones, daylight saving time comes from the Great War.
Yeah, right? I did not know that. Yeah.
The use of antibiotics it didn't come from, but was propelled by the Great War. Right? The right for women to vote was a result of the Great War, universally, because before 1914, 18, when the Great War was fought, women could vote, but in communities that allowed them to. So there wasn't the term what we use today. There wasn't a concept of universal suffrage, which is
right.
Whatever gender you are, you can vote. Even if you're a hermaphrodite, which is like both sexes, you can vote. Right?
Yeah.
And getting back to our original thing, one of these things, like I was saying, the changes, things we would never do today that we did back then, right? The fact that you would never deny someone by their gender or their ethnicity or their orientation the right to vote. You would never do that. You could actually go to jail for that, right?
Right, yeah.
to try to deny them, yeah? But a century ago and before, women just couldn't vote. And if they were stopped voting, if someone stopped them from voting, it was quite normal. So it's one of those things I discussed in my presentation also, that these changes. And I think maybe we could also talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So that's one of the things. To me, the most indelible mark that comes from the Great War is medicine and antibiotic research. And that's the main thing. And so antibiotics, meaning that the cure of infection, right? From diseases like gangrene, staphylococcus, right? Tuberculosis, which I actually, when I was 10 years old, the doctor thought I had. But all of these things we shrug off like they're nothing, right?
Right, yeah. We just take it for granted, yeah.
Right. And that was propelled by the Great War for three basic people who saw the immense destruction, but also saw people dying from wounds that they shouldn't have died from, simply because they were infected.
Right.
So that, to me, is the most indelible part of the Great War, and something that we don't appreciate today, and we should.
Yeah, no, I agree, absolutely. I think World War II gets a lot more coverage than World War I, and even that is slipping more and more into the past. I was reading one article about how millennials, a good percentage, they don't know the concentration camps, the names of the concentration camps, or what those meant. And so to go back to World War I, that must seem ancient, for newer generations and that kind of thing. But it's so important to study history and to know the origins of things and not take things for granted, to be grateful.
Was that the same study they did when they asked millennials who was Julius Caesar? And everybody said salad dressing? No?
I haven't seen that one, no.
Yeah, I think it's nuts. I was probably one who answered that too, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar idea, yeah. And just the idea that a little over 100 years ago, most people were living in extreme poverty. They're living $1 a day. I mean, there's so much we take for granted today, us being in the first world countries anyways. But yeah, no, I think that's super important. I would definitely not want to fight in World War I.
You just mentioned an interesting thing. Was that when the one right that came out of the Great War, like I said, was the right for women to vote, which it didn't come right after, like a couple of years, like 3 or 4 years down the road. And there's a reason why, and I can get into that also. But what's the big difference between the result of World War I and World War II? World War II, we had these basic ideas that people have rights.
Right.
And so there's some basic rights they have to live free from war. And one of them, what you just said, was the right not to live in poverty, the right to work at a wage that you meet the cost of living, right? And can go beyond it. And I think that's the basic thing. The second thing, the one big thing that came out of World War II was that everyone looked at each other. We looked in the mirror and we said, there's something wrong with us.
Right.
No, and I'll tell you why. Here's a really, really easy reason why. Because after the Great War, World War I, that was the post-war years. People thought this would never, ever occur again.
Right, of course.
And I remember there's a famous, when World War II began, there's a famous Canadian sort of like chaplain in the military. I forgot his name, it's slipping my mind. But he was very instrumental in detailing the Great War and how it went. And afterwards, he said the same thing: we can never go through this again. But it was a very sad story, because during World War II, he wrote a letter to the Canadian ministry. He says, "I cannot believe we're doing this again." And this is astonishing. He said, "What the heck is wrong with us? We went through 10 million people suffering and dying in the Great War."
Right.
And his name will come to me as I'm not thinking about it. And he's very famous. And he said, "I can't believe this." And the sad thing is, he died in just about in winter 1944, before seeing the end of it. So to him, it is never stopped. And so this whole perception with historians right after, it's very hard, and like you're saying for millennials, it's very hard for us to put ourselves in the mindset of people after these
Yes.
devastating things. But there was a definite look and said, there's something really wrong with this. Are we really an intelligent species or beings, or are we sophisticated monkeys throwing sophisticated weapons at each other, or sophisticated rocks?
Yeah. I know.
So that's what you just said that's really important. The thing that came out of World War II were there are these basic rights that we all should have, and there's some basic things that we should live free from. Right? And so, yeah, it's one of the big differences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just still thinking about that. For some reason, I was thinking of a quote. I think it's from Albert Einstein. Paraphrasing it, but he says, "I don't know what weapons we'll use in World War III, but I know in the war after that it'll be sticks and stones." And just like it's hard to imagine.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine like the progression and the advancements in technology and weapons and where we're going. And yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's yeah. I don't know. It gives me a lot to think about.
I think the makers of the Planet of the Apes kind of hitched onto that. What he said.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. That's that plot exactly. Yeah, and we have a lot more in common with primates and apes than I think humans like to think. Like I remember reading some fascinating study about. The idea of fairness isn't great in apes, and so like if you're giving both apes grapes, they're fine, but if you give one a chip and you don't give the other one like a chip or some other snack, it starts to freak out because it's not fair. Right. And they understand this idea of fairness. I think it's really interesting.
Good to know.
Yeah. So how long have you been studying the Great War? You said it because you said that was like the most fascinating thing. How long ago was it that you latched onto that that event specifically?
Seriously, 6 years now.
6 years. Okay.
Yeah, intensely looking at it 6 years about it. I would say, yeah.
And I mean, moving forward, where do you want to expand your research in looking at the Great War, and what other questions do you want to probe and things like that?
I could say modern times, which looks like we're heading for another world war, but I really don't want to say that. Everybody loses all hope.
Yeah, right.
I think my research is, in the short run, I'm looking at, like I said, I'm going to do these presentations about the Great War, and I want to educate people on like these things that we just talked about, how they impact the lives and they come. But I guess in the short term, I want people to understand that the Great War, everybody went into it thinking it would be a camping trip, and that's the most important thing to think about before you start to wave the home flag and say, "Oh, this is great. We're number one. We're going to go into war, and then we're going to honor it." And I think that is something that we honor these things, and we should really look at them what they are, and they're just cataclysmic destruction. You don't see, I guess today, you don't see, because we use missile strikes today, you don't see the damage from the others. But if you saw it, you would say, oh my gosh, this is still the same thing. So I think, I want to, in the short term, as far as the Great War is concerned, I want to educate people to understand that these things have an impact, and they're never really good, and they should be avoided at all costs, even if it looks good at the beginning, because to that generation it did. Right.
Sure.
Yeah. Right. I guess in the broader sense, I guess you're looking more down the road to sort of answer your question is, it goes along the same lines as why we're doing things we're doing, but what changes do we need to make, right? So like there's changes that I am fascinated with that we don't do anymore. One of them I didn't mention, which in my presentation I do mention, I find was absolutely incredible. It's anthropomorphic book covers, right? So books back at the turn of the 20th century, you would have human skin made out of them, and they were made from prisoners. Right? That is a definite violation. Okay, right. So I'm thinking to myself, I think fascinating, what are some of the things we're doing now that generations that come, I guess mid-century, the century, and beyond would see as just abhorrent, disgusting. And I'm thinking, look at them now, and maybe we can make a change.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good idea.
I think the move to sustainability is one of those great things where we're moving to either use resources efficiently or to use a completely different resource that is sustainable and much more healthy, than what we're using now.
Yeah.
Right. Back in the and that was huge. So I'm sorry, I didn't hear that question.
Oh no, there was just a slight blip. That was all with the audio. No problem. Yeah, I was just thinking. I think another problem with the advancement of warfare is that the human beings becoming more and more removed. Like I feel like in World War I, you're directly in the action, whereas now you can be in a totally different country than where the war is being fought. And in the future, when we have artificial intelligence fighting and things like that, it might lead to even more ramifications, more consequences, and harm by doing that, by being removed. So I don't know what to do about that, but
yeah, that's a good thought. I think artificial intelligence is great at collecting data. Right, and that can be good and bad, right? But you're right. The fact that we have people who are sitting in the middle of Oklahoma directing drone strikes in some other country that's on the other side of the world, right? And it reminds me of a Star Trek episode, the classic Star Trek episode, where they went to this planet and they decided that they decided to fight wars with robots, and what damage the robot did, they would assess how many people would die, and then they would send them into a chamber to kill them, right? So, right, it's kind of weird, but that whole sort of thing to me is sort of almost it's kind of touching the vanguard of what we have now. It's just that people are actually dying, but someone is sending a robot over to precision strike something, but someone always dies. They say, well, no one's going to get, only the people who weren't harmed. Even that is messed up. But it's someone. There's always collateral damage.
Yeah.
So, no, I think, yeah. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, no, that's very true. Just with the progression of artificial intelligence, there's kind of a debate of whether that'll be harmful or not, but it's just, yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, there's also a morality issue, and I think I forgot to mention that we did a short video called Armistice Day. You can find online about World War I. But at the end, I touched on it a little bit on Armistice Day. It's the morality of having these weapons that have no sense of compassion at all. They're just cold pieces of steel, landing and killing people. So that's and I'm glad you brought that up, because that might be something like you were saying. Where does it go? Where do you go from here with it? And that's something we ought to look at. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I would love to probe you more on the Great War. When you're looking. What kind of surprised you about it? Where I think briefly maybe in high school we have a chapter on the Great War, but really looking into depth, anything about the culture with the soldiers, what it was like being in the trenches? Was there anything specific that really you found very jarring or just surprising? I don't know.
Yes, what you just said was definitely surprising to me, because like you and everyone else, we read the Great War in history book, gets maybe 2 pages.
Right.
And it is sort of like a diving board into World War II.
Yep.
Right. And there were 2 different wars. B, the Great War really is this thing where people dived into it, like I said, not understanding industrialized warfare. Right. But the thing is this, that it was not called World War I until after World War II.
Right.
When historians and other people, researchers looking at it, and they decided, well, since the Great War ended in a splinter, there were no real winner. There was no real winner. Well, that's the beginning, and World War II, the job was finished. And so they decided, well, we'll call this World War One, and we'll call the Second World War, which was already called the Second World War, the Second World War. That diminished it greatly, right? So check this out. You're thinking, if I say to you the Great War, you're thinking a real cataclysm, right? But if I say to you World War One, then you're thinking, oh, this is just one of those things in history that a stepping stones. 20 years later, we went. So it's really one continuous war, and that diminishes it incredibly. The Great War was one of the. If World War II hadn't come along, it would have been the greatest cataclysm for sure ever.
Yeah,
right. But of course, it was dwarfed by World War II. So that was the big draw for me. It's like, oh my God, I'm doing my research, and I see, okay, this can't, nowhere near World War II. Right, it was just like a little splash between the great powers, and fighting a little bit in Africa, maybe in the Far East.
Right.
That's all. And I look at it and I'm seeing 10 million people. I'm thinking, oh, hang on, this is no little springboard dive. This is a catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the deeper I got into it, the deeper I saw the trenches and how people were being killed. On the Somme battle, which occurred in 1916, primarily between the British, French, and Germans, a man died every 7 seconds.
Right.
And that battle went from July to November. I mean, there's no way a general in any Western country would survive those kinds of casualties. That's just unacceptable.
Yeah.
Right. But that's how deep and incredibly deadly it was. So. And then you begin to realize this must have shaped us in some way. And it has, and again, those things I mentioned, they definitely were attachments that are still with us. So that was the most surprising thing, was to read it, to see that it really was a cataclysm like World War II.
Yeah, I almost feel like instead of being called World War One and World War II, it should be called the Great War and then the Great War Part Two. I think it's better to see World War II as a continuation of the first one than as separate.
And now today, if you watch documentaries, there's a style to call it the Great War again, to sort of separate it from World War II. So, and they were completely different wars. The one thing about the Great War, it starts serendipitously. There's a book called Sleepwalkers, and it shows how we just walked into it. Everyone thought this was going to be a fun camping trip, and they had no idea that they were going up against industrialized warfare and the horrors of it. The World War II, we had an idea. The thing with World War II, we see where it starts and we see where it ends. The Great War isn't like that. It actually starts like 40 years before it actually started, right?
Right, yeah.
It finishes in a sort of like half-splintered way where everybody's like agreeing, okay, we're going to stop fighting. But those of us who got more, who left with more people, well, we're going to kind of dictate the rules of how it should end and who should get the better of it. So, yeah, I find that. And the other thing that's fascinating, like I mentioned before, is that in the 1920s and 30s, that was the post-war year. No one ever thought this would ever happen again, and they did their best to try to not let it happen again.
Yeah, no, it's really crazy. And also, I think the other thing that's putting World War One more out of people's radar is, I mean, the oldest people alive right now, I mean, they're either born during World War One or afterwards, and that's just gonna, as time progresses, everyone who's alive would have been born after it and wouldn't have any recollection, And I think that's what makes the job of historians so important, keeping these documents and continuing to have documentaries and write books. It's so deep into that, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is, the time, the distance of time makes it, puts it back into memory. There was a time when Pearl Harbor Day was like a day up until 1970s was like the most day where people would actually stop and, and remember. And since now, today, we just sort of like, okay, we remember, but we continue on with our lives.
Right.
There was a man in the trenches named Henry Patch.
Okay.
And it struck me, as you said, the passage of time. He did something that I find incredible, and I would say would be impossible for anyone to do, right?
Okay.
But he did it. He lived 3 centuries. Yeah,
That's
right.
awesome.
And he became the last man to have ever fought in the Great War, the last soldier who died.
Right.
When he died, there was a phrase coined that said that the Great War finally left living memory, human living memory. So check this out. How does someone live 3 centuries, right? Yeah. So there's 2 things. One, you got to have in your genes, of course, your DNA.
Right.
And as healthy as people are today, it might just happen again. But it's timing. So he was born at the end of the 19th century in 1897, 1898.
Right.
Crossed into the 20th century, fought in World War I.
Yeah.
And after he got injured at a battle called Passchendaele in 1917. And he went home and he went back to England and he was doing what he always does. He was throwing rocks in a pond and skipping them, right?
Yeah.
And the 1920s came along and he would throw these rocks and skip them. 1930s came along, he would throw the rocks and skip 1940s. And it goes all the way up to the year 2000 and goes beyond it. Right? And finally expires in the year 2009. He was the last soldier we know to have ever been there. So the Great War, when he died in 2009, it left living memory, that's as they say. But I'm thinking, forget about the Great War. How did someone live 3 centuries?
And not just like 3 centuries, but the entire 20th century. We have World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and onwards. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. And then, I mean, his mind just must have been blown over and over again, though, with technology. Like, back then, sci-fi writers thought we would have flying cars. That was conceivable. But the internet, like, that was inconceivable. And I always want to do that, like, as a thought experiment. You go back in time, even to, like, the 70s, and try to explain the internet to somebody. I don't, like, it's just it's too out there. It's too big of a step.
So can you imagine what he saw, what he was witness to? He saw society go from Victorian age to tablets.
Right. Yeah.
That's incredible.
I know. He would have been an incredible person to interview or have a conversation with. I mean, just the history that he experienced. I can't imagine. It's the bottom line. No, that's an extraordinary life, and now that's going to happen, I think, soon with World War II. We'll have the last World War II veteran, die. And so it's so important not to take these people for granted.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be pretty hard for World War II vets to cross 3 centuries, but if they do, okay.
Yeah, no, I don't think that'll happen. I'm like, well, maybe with technology. I don't know. But yeah, no. It's funny. That's always been a life goal of mine, is to live 3 centuries, because I was born in 94. So I realized I have to be 107.
You could do it. You could. I wouldn't be able to, but you could do it. Don't lie. It might happen. You might do it.
Might be possible. I just love it. And then people be like, well, what's your secret? How did you live so long? I'm like, well, I just drink water, and just some bullshit like that. I don't know.
Check this out. Can you check this out? Can you imagine what you're going to see?
Oh, yeah.
From society go
right
1994 to the internet age to like, we don't know what's coming, but if you did make it into 2000, what is it? 20, not 2002, but I mean to say, the year 3000, right?
Yeah. Or 2100. Yeah.
If we make it, because I'm not sure, but can you imagine what you'll see?
Right.
That's astounding.
Yeah.
The depression.
Yeah, absolutely. I was having this great conversation with an engineer, and he was explaining to me what quantum computing is, and I still don't understand it, but he came up with a great analogy that I love, where he said, like, the computer is the abacus. The abacus is like what Indians play with, like Indian boys play with, that you can use as a calculator. He's like, that to the computer is what computing is to the quantum computing. It's like, it's that much of a big step. So I don't know. Wow. It's just, that's I guess the next big thing, but. No, I'm just thinking, man, if I was like old in some futuristic retirement home, or hopefully in my own home, and they interview me and they're like, oh, this person, when he was like before the age of 10 was disconnected from the internet, was disconnected, or I don't know how they would label it, but yeah, it's a weird thing to think about for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, anyways, I was just looking more at your background. So, in addition to looking deep into the Great War, I saw also here that you're a yoga and Pilates fitness instructor. What's the background behind that? I just want to see another aspect of
Yeah.
your character.
Well, that has nothing to do with the Great War, but the Great War does have something to do with yoga being
Okay,
Western.
here we go.
So, yeah. But in any case, me personally, I guess I came to it through an injury, practicing another Asian art, some mild hobbyist practicing judo, and I suffered a fall where my sciatic nerve was trapped in my back, which happens to a lot of people, a lot of athletic people. And it was about, I would say, maybe 10, 12 years ago, and it was interesting because it does have a social aspect to it, because this was before the whole healthcare debate, universal coverage or Obamacare. And I went to the doctor to see if I can barely walk from the injury.
Right.
And I went to the doctor, and she took some x-rays, blah, 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 came talking about it. And she said, okay, check it out. We can operate. That's probably the only way to get that sciatic nerve. Because the sciatic nerve it's a nerve that's trapped in the muscle, or I guess the disc sometimes presses on the neurons in the back, and it causes pain. And we can relieve the tension through operation. The operation cost about $70,000. And I'm like, you're out of your mind. I was a student then. I'm like, there's no way.
Right. Yeah.
Even if I had the money, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
And so at the time, one of my former instructors at University of Maryland had gotten a hold of me, and I told her about it. And she said, here, she wrote down a piece of paper. She said, go see so-and-so at the yoga studio and on campus. And I'm thinking, well, what does this have to do with the price of eggs? I've got an injury here that needs surgery.
Right.
And she's like, go see this person, and maybe they may be able to do some sort of physical therapy to help you out, because at least you can walk easy.
Yeah.
So this wasn't a problem, because I always had some athleticism behind in my background. Like I said, I danced a lot, and the judo and everything was already there. So I went to this first class, and I'm barely walking into the wall, and I gave her my professor's name. Said, she see you about this problem here. I can barely walk, so I didn't know about it. The woman puts me into what they call a child's pose, and begins to do some sort of therapy behind on my back, and she frees the nerve, right? And I'm like, I get this electric shock, and like, it's like lights are on, and all of a sudden I'm walking again without limping. I'm not. It's not like a miracle or anything. Like I was walking slow, but at least I was walking.
Right.
And that's sort of kind of like, it didn't sell me on the practice, but it made me want to come back. And so many people have a story about yoga where they've come to it through an injury, or they have some sort of mental stress. So for me, it was this injury. And so as I came back, it's sort of like the yoga became sort of like therapeutic. And eventually, and within about, I would say 2 or 3 months, it worked itself out. And I was back to normal again. I wouldn't say 99%, but I would say roughly 90%, 85%. I'm sorry, 90%, I would say my back came back. And I could do all the things I could do before. And it was great. And so I avoided $70,000. There's a story behind that where Tiger Woods, the golfer, back in the day, he had the same problem, but he had the surgery, and he was never able to come back to play. I think these days he can play a little bit.
Right.
But it shows you, to me, it showed me how alternative medicine, you should always explore alternatives before having surgery.
Right.
And that kind of brought me to it. And so, yeah, that's that. And so from there, I just kept deeper into the practice. I found it was mentally soothing as well as physical. And it was a great urban. It's something you can do urban also. You don't need a big field to do. It's nice to do outside. But yeah.
Yeah. And you liked it so much that you became an instructor later, right?
Yes, I became an instructor later. After coming back to the United States, working or practicing at the DC public libraries, and that's where pretty much I sort of cut my teeth as a yoga instructor.
Yeah.
And that led to all kinds of things like I do a lot of acro yoga also.
What is
But
that for our listeners? Can you define
okay,
that?
so acro yoga is you're working with pairs of people or more than that, multitudes of people, and you are using yourself and the other person to work and to do postures in pairs. And some of them are like gymnastic postures, like handstands, headstands, but you're just doing them with another person. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a great way of people to connect with each other. Right? So it's like some people also call it tumbling because it looks like there's a lot of gymnastics, and there's a lot of gymnastic elements to it. But so it's just yoga working in pairs, and you can achieve these types of postures that you couldn't achieve just by yourself.
Right. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. You don't get the whole community element in there and then human connection and all that. Great stuff. Yeah, I definitely myself want to experiment more with yoga and with dancing because I do a lot of just meditation by myself, but I would love to, explore other forms of mindfulness and
Just
explore movement. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just put integrate movements with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean,
Well, that's the Tai Chi you
yeah.
were telling me about.
Right, Tai Chi. That's what I was going to mention because my dad's been teaching that for like 45 years now, and it's funny when I'm sitting too still, I start moving my arms. I should learn it formally, but I've always watched him doing it and used to teach people actually in our backyard, which was pretty cool. But yeah, having the movement, it's like it just adds another dimension to it. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's really cool. And so, yeah, so I'm curious. I mean, you have pretty eclectic interests, and so you do the yoga, you do dancing, you do, this in-depth research on the Great War. I'm just curious what your day-to-day routine looks like and how you manage stress and like it seems like you have balance overall.
Yeah, that's another thing I'm thankful for the yoga for because the balance of it transfers into your social life where you're trying to juggle all these things and you can balance them out properly. So yeah, my day basically begins with pretty early in the morning where I'm looking at what I'm working with as far as the Hague files, what research project I'm looking at,
Hmm.
whether it's going to be writing or putting up a website, or most of the time it's a video. So I'm working with that. I'm also a hobbyist pianist.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and so I play a little bit in the mornings. I have to find I have a lot of energy in the mornings there, and maybe do a little dancing, possibly some yoga, and then head off to work. Work most of the day, and then afterwards, I'm gonna do probably depends on what night it is, but I have things I do in the evening time. One is on Tuesday nights. I sometimes go swing dancing.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, Friday nights are mostly for five rhythm dancing, which I love a lot. It's really cool, which is more than five rhythms, or five songs really. Um, so Wednesday nights are nights I usually teach yoga, and so yeah, with it's sort of like sometimes a break in there with Mondays and Thursdays and maybe Sundays, but yeah, so that's what pretty much it looks like. Saturdays, I do tango dancing on Saturdays.
Huh. Yeah.
So it seems like yeah.
No, that's a great diversity of dancing. No, that's really cool. Which form of dancing did you learn first?
My first real form of dancing is swing. I started learning
Okay.
first,
Nice.
and tango, which I'm glad I began tango early because tango can be a bit complicated.
Yeah. Bad.
and, and so like with five rhythms and others, you can dance and just do anything in your own, come up with your own rhythms, come up with your own patterns, which really what dancing is patterns and this rhythmical. dimension, right? But it's tango, it's almost you're working with another person and you have these series of movements that you have to master in order to make it all work. Right? You've seen tango before, right? And you're looking at, wow, how do they, you're in sync. And the thing is, to really get good at it, it takes 2 or 3 years, and you have to hang in there.
Right.
Yeah. And so most people can't. For sure, if I had come to other forms of dancing before tango, I would have never done it. But there's a good feeling of accomplishment when you've got it.
Sure.
And it's, again, these patterns that you're moving through and these rhythms you're moving through and the connection you make with another person, which all makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I don't know what type of dance I was observing. Somebody was telling me it was like feminist hip hop. I went to this like a spoken word event, and I was an hour early, and it was at a dance studio, so I saw all these men and women dancing. I mean, college and high school age, and I was just like, I really want to do that. I was really I was really bummed because like about a month ago I dislocated my knee, so movement's a little tricky. But once that heals, definitely want to get back into that. It was kind of, of all people, it was the horror writer Stephen King who had the quote, "Dancing is life," and I thought it was interesting coming from him because he's like the last person I would expect to like be a dancer. I don't think he is even a dancer, but like the fact that he said that I think is so great. And he spends most of his time sitting, but it's just a great thing to observe, and I saw how happy they were, and like and just kind of observing that vibrancy and everything. It's really cool. And also I just want to say, like, how long have you been doing music and doing piano? Because I also play piano and find it to be very therapeutic, and I'm just curious your experience with it.
Yeah, I started probably when I was living back in Toronto as a kid. Never really took a set. I started like maybe 11 or 12. I was actually, I sort of started and then I began to play cello.
Okay.
Which I found much easier than piano. But I kept with it. And so it sort of like developed. It didn't just happen, right? And so I find there's certain things I think with learning, sometimes it's best to approach it in a more relaxed way and just let it occur on its own.
Right.
Because I found when I was younger, when I tried to play a certain piece, like it was just havoc. It was like the Great War, right? And then if I just sort of like picked out one note at a time and then go at it for maybe a span of time, 6 months or so, and just let it occur, I could play it. Yeah. So I think mathematics is like that also, where it shouldn't be shoved down someone's throat. It should be like just absorbing it. Particularly high level types of math, calculus, algebra, geometry. You should allow people to absorb it more, and I think they would better appreciate it. So for me, it was kind of like that. I started playing, and it was like anyone else picking with one finger or 2 fingers for like a long time, right? And I never suspected I could actually play it, but it was always there. I guess in Toronto growing up, it was so cold that whatever you did inside, you did. And so it just sort of like happened over time. And I didn't think much of it at all until I started making video. And I realized that talent could be used in our video work. And so particularly if you see any of our work, particularly Armistice Day, like we were talking about, you'll see me actually there playing piano on it.
That's great.
And credits. So, yeah, that's great. I didn't know you also have pianist too. That's cool.
Yeah, I've been playing for 20 years or so, on and off. But
whoa.
Yeah, but I mean, I was classically trained. I did some experimentation with jazz, and then I was just recently been learning by ear and playing more contemporary music. But yeah, it's a great thing. I mean, I feel like I would love to teach people how to play piano as well. Like, but instead of doing like Suzuki or the Mary Had a Little Lamb or however people usually start, that was my beginning. I think I could teach more fun or interesting music even from the beginning. What I like about the piano is you can make it as simple or as complex as you like, and so And it always just puts me in a different dimension. It's great. But I think I like playing it best
Yeah,
just
it's
alone
therapy.
in solitude. Yeah, it's just a really enjoyable thing. Um, yeah.
Yeah, right. I'm sure you find like different personalities of yourself within it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. It was through piano and creative writing that I realized I had depression before I felt it, and that anything that I would compose or create would always be kind of sad or dark. And I'm like, oh, where did that come from? You know? But this is just like the unconscious, and it's just when this would be on the page, or we would go on the notes or whatever, and it's like, wow, just everything I'm coming up with is sad. You know, why is that? But with poetry and so forth, and so it was an interesting thing, but I think that was my truth, and so piano helped me, to share that. So I don't know. I
Good.
mean, have you ever done any compositions or anything with piano, or do you more just how do you learn songs and music, and what's your process, I guess?
Well, to answer your first question, yeah, I have like a couple of compositions I've written,
Right.
original,
Nice.
and mostly they become backdrops for the videos that we do.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting. Like I think I was sort of like you said, experiment. I think for my piano, I started like I said, 11. I had a piano teacher like everybody else,
Mm-hmm.
and I think for her, I was some sort of like psychotic case.
Go on.
Yeah, right. So what is this, right? So like the reason why is that my piano teacher would use these flashcards, right,
Oh.
to learn the notes of the scale.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and like she would have these flashcards, and she would write one big note on the flashcard,
Huh.
and with how like you have 4 bars, is it, or in spaces there, not
Yeah.
4 bars, but lines, and then to create the measures.
Right.
Like she had 2 lines. I'm like, okay, is this an eagle? Maybe it's a car. I don't know. It's a cloud in the sky. And she would just sit there with me, like, okay, what is that? And then I would guess it, and she didn't tell me if I was right or wrong. Then she would say, okay, cover one of your eyes. Okay, now what note is this? And I'm thinking, this has got to be some kind of psychotherapy. So from that, I started to learn the notes of the scales and all that. But I'm
Right.
thinking, what an outside of the box way
Yeah.
to teach them. And I'm thinking, this has got to be some kind of psychoanalysis. And I just
They're on to me.
Sure.
Run. Yeah. No.
That worked.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah, I've never heard of that technique. I had personally started with Suzuki, and then I think the piano teacher I disliked the most, she would like give me grades like with different stickers or things and give homework and things like that. And I was just so turned off by that. I think I was like 10 or 11 at the time, and then I switched into jazz, which was more fun.
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Most people I know, or a lot of the famous pianists, also didn't go by learning to read at first. They just went by by the air, because
Mhm.
it just felt natural.
Right.
And I think to think about playing by notes is a bit complicated. But I think both are good. I play by both, and
Mhm.
my piano teacher started me with the classics, the Beethoven, the Bach,
Right.
the Mozart, and I still do play some classical, but most of the compositions I do are sort of like my own and how I feel, and what I really need is if I have an idea, like you're saying, you do creative writing.
Mhm.
If I have an idea for poetry, what would be really good music from the backdrop? And then I also, thanks to the miracle of tracking of what do I say, software recording, I also have like a little keyboard synthesizer where I can produce strings, bells, and all kinds of sounds, and I can make it sound like an orchestra behind me. So it's really cool.
Yeah, no, I really want to listen to that, and I'll definitely when I post this video and the link in the description, I'll post your video of the Armistice video and all that. That'll be great. Um, yeah, yeah, I was just thinking with the creative process, like if I'm ever composing a piece of music or poetry, it just kind of comes all of a sudden. Like if I sit down on the piano and say, okay, I'm gonna create something, nothing happens. But if I'm playing a different song, it just happens. Yeah, on the fly. It's kind of weird. I can't like force it. It just has to flow. But no, that's really cool. Just thinking, I mean, as a researcher, you must read a lot of books. Is there any books that you read recently that you find really fascinating, or that's like really lit you up and helped you see the world a different way? Um, just curious.
As far as books, there's like two. Since spoke with the Great War, the one that really got me into it was the Guns of October.
Okay.
And I forget the woman's name. Her name, first name is Barbara. Slips me, but that was a really big entry into understand why it occurred, which I couldn't really figure out. Most people can't, and that's why they quit. They don't really care much for it. That was a really big with the Great War and learning about it, sort of entry into it. The other one was Longitude. It was a book about a guy named George Harrison, who was the one who figured out how ships could determine their position with longitude back in the day. And that had an effect on me. I can't say how, but the person who did it, George Harris, not Harris, George Harris, it took almost his life work. It took him almost an entire adult life to figure it out. And what he did was he used fuck first, and then he switched to a sort of like a watch, a gigantic watch, which up until it worked all the way from, I guess he lived in the 16th century, figured out, and it worked all the way up to 1992 when we went to satellite positioning. But before then, you still see them too, these like gigantic clocks where in the blockhouse steering column of the boat where the captain is. And I thought that affected me, like how I would put so much, the total life's work into it. And then he was not credited for it. The reason why he wasn't credited for it when he first figured it out was that Isaac Newton, the great physicist, who was part of the London Royal Society then, had profusely believed that you could only figure out longitude. This is the lines we're talking about planet Earth that determine your position. The only way you could figure it out is through the stars, right? And this was never accurate. It never really worked out because the stars would shift, right? If they move too, you're moving, and planet Earth's moving. So I mean, you're going to be inaccurate from day to day. Yeah. You can figure out your latitude by the position of the sun, no problem. But the longitude, and many ships were wrecked because of it. So reading about him, his life, work, and how he came up with it, I found just really fascinating. And the perseverance of figuring out longitude, it took a long time. And the use of a clock to figure it out was that. I would recommend anyone read Longitude. It's really, even if you don't have a scientific background or a research background, just read it anyway, just to see the perseverance that George Harris had. John Harris, sorry.
John Harris, yeah, okay.
John Harris, right. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So the Canadian guy just came to my mind.
Yes.
Who I was talking about, his name is Canon Frederick Scott.
Okay.
I have tons of names in my memory banks of history, and sometimes they take. But so yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No. That's really cool. For some reason, when you're talking about the book Longitude, I was thinking of another book I really liked, called by Bill Bryson, called like a short history of nearly everything. And what I liked about that is it does a deep dive into the lives of these scientists who made these great discoveries and do these great things. But you see how eccentric some of these scientists were. And I was kind of recalling it because you were mentioning Isaac Newton and his stuff, where like what fascinates me so much about Isaac Newton was he spent more time working with alchemy and working and trying to calculate when Jesus would come back to Earth than the laws of gravity or calculus. I mean, he spent like a really, really long time on this other non-scientific stuff, and just had such and had bizarre morning rituals where like he would lie on his back and be kicking his feet, and that would help him think, and different stuff like that. And I'm always fascinated by human behavior and stuff like that. And so,
Right.
yeah, for some reason I was just reminded of that. But it's cool what it sounds like in the book Longitude. They do a deep dive in this one guy's life who figured it out, and I'm always blown away by people in the past who figured out things like that just when they didn't have the technology, really. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. And to come up with it.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, on that subject, I guess, of past people, who would you most love to have a coffee conversation with? They can be alive or dead. Any mentor or person you look up to, you've read about.
You know what? It's funny because the people I'd like to have lunch with, right, are probably some of the most horrific in history. So I could just sit there and say, what? Why? Right? Why do this? I mean, it's obviously going down a bad road, right? It's like having coffee with Genghis Khan. I'm like, why? I mean, why kill so many people, right? If you didn't like them, then just, like put them in a drawer or something, why kill them? So that's one person. I think probably, geez, there's so many. Okay, so let's say people alive. So just for the millennials, so they can. All right, so there's two. One is Kanye West.
Oh my God. Okay.
Right? Yeah. Right. So, because the same thing I can say. Why? What? Just to sort of pry into to what little mind he has, but just why, right? Musical wise, I'd love to talk with Sting, the musician.
Okay.
I find his music just fascinating, from the Police, the whole gamut, from the Police all the way to his jazz, to what he does now. Definitely, it would be a really interesting conversation, I think.
Yeah.
And who else? Let's see. I'm thinking someone who may have done some influence with me. Sting is the only person I can think of right now, but definitely. Let's say non-living person, if I could.
Yeah.
That would be a good question. Probably the father of modern medicine, a man named Robert Koch.
Okay.
Yeah, he was he sort of like led the charge to pathology, to antibacterial medicine, and he sort of did it with he did something we did. He created his own laboratory where there was none. He built something where there was nothing,
right?
And then make his studies there. And I think the fascinating thing about Robert Koch was figuring out that chemical dyes can make you see bacteria. And that's like, how did you do that? Oh, and of course, Gabriella Roth, who is no longer with us. I mean, like, how do you come up with 5 of them dancing? That's so cool. I love it so much, But I think for her, it just developed over time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe when you're talking to them, your question of why, they would be like, I don't know. It just came to me, It's just
like, why do that stuff? But definitely alive Kanye West. And it's the same thing. Like, why?
No, I'm very fascinated by Kanye West. I love to, from a neuroscience angle, see what's going on inside his brain.
That would be good for you, yeah.
Yeah, that would be a good experiment. No, because I really do like his music. I feel like something I read on Reddit gave me an interesting perspective, where they said, since he's been with Kim Kardashian, it's like the fact that their lives are always on camera that's going to unhinge you. And maybe Kim Kardashian, she just built her life around it, so it's okay. But Kanye was adopted into it a little bit. And I'm like, so maybe he just needs privacy. I don't know. I think I preferred his music before he was with Kim Kardashian for sure. I'm just gonna blame it on her. No, I don't know. I don't know what's going on, with him. So
some people, they change as they get older.
Yeah.
Right. So like, I don't know. It's like, I don't know, the Bill Cosby thing, like what he did.
Right.
And like before 1980, he didn't do it. Right. Mm-hmm. It seemed like in the 1980s. So people change. And so that's another, maybe for neuroscience, like why do people, these completely normal people who have worked all their lives so hard to do great things, why do they do these horrible things in the scalp? In the closet.
Yeah, and it could very well be brain damage. I mean, a new development being made in neuroscience is bringing it into the courtroom, where there's this really eerie, scary story, but really fascinating of, I forget this serial killer's name, but before he went to do an atrocious crime, I think in the 70s or the 80s, he wrote a note and he said, "There's something wrong with my brain. Yeah. Please look at it after I commit this crime." And sure enough, they looked at it in an autopsy, and he did have holes in his brain.
Is this the son of Sam, I think?
Yeah, that's it. That was it, yeah. I mean,
I don't
that's
think
so interesting.
Why that guy did that. He's another one. Why? I mean...
It would probably be like the voices are telling me to do it. I don't know. Like it's just it's really confusing stuff. But I asked that question a lot too. A show I started watching on Netflix I love that you might like is called Mindhunters. I think David Fincher is the creator behind it, but it's about when the FBI started using behavioral science and psychology to investigate serial killers and really talk to them to track, and try to prevent future serial killers. And it's really, it's quite fascinating. But
I think the category of like the thing with like violent shootings also can fall into that category. It's like, what would make someone normal just do something like that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really tough. I mean, sometimes it goes back to nihilism. Like for instance, one of the guys behind Columbine, the Columbine shooter, he had journals and he had all these writings, and he would say things like, "I wish humanity," which he included himself in. That's what made him so dangerous, was he's willing to kill himself. He said, "I wish all of humanity had one neck so I could strangle it." That's what he wrote in his journal before he committed the shooting. And so, when you have that attitude and you're willing to die and sacrifice in their view, maybe in their perspective, it's like the amount of harm that you can cause is unlimited, I think. I mean, it's like, so... But the why question is so important. I wish instead of people just judging and labeling people and putting them in different categories and saying they're a monster, they would ask the why question and really try to get to the root of their behavior, if possible. Some people, maybe that's not possible. But no, I think that's really important. Yeah, absolutely. Another question I like to ask my guests is, where are you now, and where would you like to be in 10 years? What are your future goals?
It's funny about that. It's like I am less off than I was 10 years ago. So I did something wrong, right? Now you know why I look into catastrophes. Okay, so let's just put a positive spin on this.
Yes.
So like, where I'd like to see myself 10 years from now, maybe doing some important research, I think. Something that matters, something that can definitely, I mean, it sounds kind of cliche, but definitely something that benefits society. Right. I think there is, I think you mentioned earlier something of the poverty that has struck people that was much more back a century ago. And is much more alleviated today. But I don't think that's out of the kindness of people's hearts. I think it's just because of industrial force dimensions at play where we can just grow food better,
right?
More of it. There is something called the United Nations has something called the Millennium Development Goals,
right?
And in that package, they were going to try to eliminate poverty completely. by the year 2015 and 2016. Well, those years have passed.
Right. Didn't happen. Yeah.
They did okay, but we still have poverty. So those are some things I think we all should work on. But I think it's not so much, for me, it's not so much that 10 years from now I'm doing something, but maybe 10 years from now I can get everybody to do something.
Mm.
Right?
Right.
And that have much more effect, much more impact. And I think that's what the generation of the 60s learned, that you can only protest and cause so much rebel rousing. There has to be a whole critical mass of people working on an issue to really make a difference, because it just fades into history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you see in the 60s, people looking for utopia, particularly in Western California, where they're like, well, dude, we're just tuning out and we're going to grow our own food and we're forgetting about, humanity and maybe we can make a change so that people don't fight wars, etc., don't do bad things. And I think what they discovered, that all faded into history. It was a utopia that never occurred. It occurred in some ways because we have some impact from it, the ecological thing, the sustainable environment. But I think you would really have to have, you'd have to find a way to change minds so that everybody gets involved. And I think if you ask me that question 10 years from now, I'd like to be a part of something that is sort of like a mass movement that creates a better change.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Yeah.
And of course, $1 billion in my account. So.
So you can do in-depth research on Kanye West and also use that money to bring people back from the dead and interview them too.
Yeah, well, yeah. More so bringing people back from the dead. Kanye West would probably be just a laugh, but I don't know. A good laugh, right? So,
yeah.
It's funny that I've got some Facebook drawings about Kanye West, and I'm thinking he's going to enter my research somewhere soon, because Saturday Night Live's predicting he might be vice president, right?
Oh man!
So don't laugh, because it was the Simpsons that predicted Donald Trump would be president.
I know, I saw that. Yeah.
There you go. It's not
anything's possible. Yeah.
Right, so it's not
Maybe. Oh, I was gonna say maybe he'll cause World War III, and then you can do that in your research. I don't know. Yeah. That's the thing. Yeah, with Donald Trump being president, it really opens the gates to anyone thinking they can run.
Or say anything.
Yeah, or say anything. That too. I think that that had to be the watershed moment with Kanye West, when people started disliking him, was when he interrupted Taylor Swift. I think before that point, people were like, okay, he has an ego, but it wasn't like a knee-jerk response. After that kind of solidified, I think, his reputation.
Yeah, I think so.
I would do it. So I'm curious, I saw in your background that you travel a lot. A question I like to ask is, like, if you could visit any place on Earth right now, where would that be? What would be your top pick?
The island of Palau in the South Pacific.
Okay, tell me about it.
Italy would be the second. Okay, so Palau and the island, it's sort of like, it has this like really mysterious lagoon. It's a tropical island, and it has these incredible jellyfish. They're not poisonous,
Nice.
but they move in migration in packs. And what they do is they do a really interesting thing. They're actually farmers.
Huh.
Right? You ever heard of jellyfish being farmers?
No, yeah.
So in this lagoon, these jellyfish, they're really nice looking creatures. They float up to the surface of the lagoon, and they absorb sunlight because they're growing plants in their bodies.
Huh.
In their like crops, in their gut. And then when the sun goes down, they submerge deep into the water. And I think what they're doing is absorbing nitrates from the plants in their body. So they totally don't need to attack each other or anything else. They just grow these like little microplants in their body. And so they're completely harmless. And it's a great way of farming. And talk about using your resources efficiently, right?
Yeah, seriously, that's really cool. I never heard of that. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, jellyfish.
The second place I would say is that.
No, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say
I was going to
jellyfish.
say the second.
So sorry, yeah, that's all.
Go ahead. You got
Sorry, I was just saying how bizarre jellyfish are. I don't know. I was just thinking of them. It's fine.
it.
Yeah.
Well, check this out. We like to think that the lower on the intellectual chain, because they don't have much of a brain, just a neurological pattern, right? So we would say we're better than them, but we have a brain and we're constantly screwing things up. So
There you go.
jellyfish might be better, right? So then the second place, I would say Rome, only because remember we were talking about if anyone that you'd like to interview.
Right.
Like asked, I'd love to go back and just to walk where Caesar walked, and just kind of look at being in a place where the society that dominated the planet for like I don't know 2,000, 3,000 years.
Right. Yeah.
Right? That the question for them wouldn't be why, it would be how. How did you do that? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, only the British Empire was. Came close, and that's no more. So,
right.
How'd you guys dominate the world for so long? And how could I do that without killing people? They'll probably look at me and say, "Hey, start a career on Wall Street." I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. Absolutely. I was just thinking. I was a few years ago. I was studying abroad in the south of France, and I made friends with an Italian guy. And I mean, obviously he's been to Rome and all over Italy, but he was just telling me about like the culture there, and like if you're in I think Naples, like if you get on a four-way intersection. The person to go out first is who exaggerates more. Like you have to get out of your car and make like a.
I've heard that.
And I'm like, man, I would just never go. I would just stay at the intersection. I would be too shy. Yeah. No. So I don't know. Yeah, I was just thinking of that. Yeah.
I was going to say, there's an interesting social behavior that could be marked with the Italians, is that they are the least wired people in the Western world.
What do you mean?
Right. So they will spend only so much time on the internet or talking to each other on, through social networks.
Right.
And that's it. Right. So like here in the US or maybe in other places where I've lived, like people stay there all the time, sometimes all day, and they would never do that.
Right.
And what's the most wired place probably on the planet is South Korea.
Yeah, definitely.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Wait, go on.
The thing about the Italians, that's a good way to look at it, because I mean that's not good for you to sit down all day and be like. There's some people that are just trolls. They just look on Facebook, on the internet, just to hammer other people. Right. I'm thinking you need to do some fiber than dancing. Okay.
There you go.
For real, man. More inspirational life.
Yeah.
Just sit there chastising people.
I know, it's horrible. It's something that blew my mind about Italy. I saw this video a long time ago. I need to find it again, but it was talking about how one of the big difference between southern Italy, like Sicily, versus northern Italy is that in the south of Italy, or at least in Sicilian language, they don't have a future tense. And so I feel like that must totally warp the way you perceive the world, and would explain why they're much more present or past focused, and they just kind of enjoy meals, have a good time, and then the northern Italians are upset because they're like, hey, what about the economy, and there's that whole dynamic. But it's like, man, if even your language doesn't allow the future tense, I mean, how much that will change you.
It's interesting. I lived in Europe also. The thing is that in the Spanish and I guess in certain Germanic languages, verbs come at the end of the sentence.
Right.
And for me, it was weird when I was learning it, but that's got to have an effect on your perception of things, like you're saying.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. As some comedian I found had such a funny bit on Japanese culture and the language and how the verb comes at the end. And so he says that's why Japanese are such good listeners, is that you have to wait until the end to know what you're talking about. It's like, yeah, that's pretty interesting. So no, language is huge. Language is everything. I mean, yeah, no, it's super important. And oh yeah, I just wanted to ask real quick, like, what was your experience in the Netherlands like? It sounds like you spent a good amount of time there. I'm moving to Amsterdam this September to do a master's in
Oh, no way.
neuroeconomics. Yeah, so I'm really excited
That's
about that.
awesome.
Yeah, yeah. So where did you live in the Netherlands?
Well, I lived in a small town called Alkmaar,
Okay.
which is the Netherlands version of Wisconsin.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, they produce a lot of cheese and a lot of dairy products there, which is interesting because I don't eat dairy products much. I can't digest them. But yeah, so I guess the first part of your question, like the most interesting thing I found in Amsterdam, well, it's the bike riding.
Yeah.
It's like you're born. There's two things you're born with when you're from the Netherlands. One is a bike. The other is a soccer ball.
Yeah.
And they take soccer very seriously in the Netherlands. And I remember like watching the World Cup and hearing people go crazy if the Netherlands scored a goal or something. And I remember telling my landlord, I'm like, look, I don't get this, right? So like, this is just people kicking a ball around. It's just a game. And he's like, no, man, it's football.
It's a religion.
What they call
yeah.
football, soccer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, insane amounts of appreciation for soccer, football. But I found the bike riding thing interesting. But what the most interesting thing I think anyone should know going into the Netherlands is that the windmills, the traditional windmills, right?
Yeah.
You know, with the people with the wooden shoes back in the day.
Right.
We know what the modern ones are for, to generate power. But the traditional windmills actually do something. And they do a lot. So I was talking to my landlord when I first got there, and I said, I thought these things were ornamentations. And then he was showing me like a grid pattern that they were built in. And I'm thinking to myself, come on, Dex, these things are all over the place. They didn't just build them because they just felt like it.
They have a purpose.
To build a windmill, right? And it turns out they do something called poldering. So the Netherlands is like at sea level.
Yeah.
Even sometimes below sea level. And flooding occurs. And what those windmills do as the wind sails turn, the propellers, they drain excess water from the land, right? And they send the water into channels that it can be most productive. And that's why the country has so many canals.
Yeah,
so
it's
interesting. Really fascinating. And so now, while they're doing that, you can attach gears inside the windmill, and they've got these like little compartments or big compartments. You can attach gears to a container, and you can mix paints. You can make creams, butter, oils, anything you can think of. And one of the things that my landlord was getting was bread from a windmill owner across the road because he was mixing the dough with the windmill. And he was just all with the wind. I'm talking about, wow, that is using your resources.
Yeah.
I think that's
right. I was just remembering one of my favorite speakers and psychologists, a guy named Jordan Peterson. He did a speech in the Netherlands, and the first thing he said before he dived in was, you guys should be underwater right now. Do you realize that? Like, he's like a huge fan of the Dutch. He's like, you are so organized. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah, when it comes to that.
Yeah. No, and also, I mean, it's funny. My brother always thought it was so weird. Me and my brother are half French, but I always really liked the Dutch soccer team. Ever since 2008, I just saw them kind of dominate against France and Italy and these great teams. And I really got into their team, and I became a big Dutch supporter, even though I'd never visited the country or anything. And now I'm going to be moving there, which I think is great. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know why I like the soccer team so much, but I did. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I made a video, my friends and I who work with there's four of us who work in the Hague Files, freelance, or just help out. We made a video called Feel the Breeze about traditional windmill. Okay. And it does have really cool Dutch soccer playing in it.
Nice.
Maybe you might want to put.
Yeah, just send me the link after the interview. Yeah, absolutely.
Classic.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. I think just to conclude this interview, a good question I'd like to end with is, what are the most memorable?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, Mister, I have so much work to do. You know, it's kind of like. What, Dexter? What are the most memorable words of advice you have ever received?
Most memorable words of advice. Oh, there's been so many. Nobody dies to Rutgers University. That's it. Yeah, I thought that was memorable.
Why is that? Yeah.
The theme. Nobody dies to Rutgers.
Okay.
Let's see. The famous, of course, with the Neville Chamberlain speech, or the paraphrase he said. I think that's, of course, he's from the generation of World War One. He was the British Prime Minister who tried to reason with Hitler to try to stop him, to sort of like stop him from from another world war breaking out. And historians have kind of been rough on him, and they've said, why would you try to reason with this guy? I mean, right. But of course they're looking from at hindsight, and they're like, why would you try? And why did you have a chance to just say, we're not going to let you take Czechoslovakia, we're not going to let you take these other things, and you could have stopped it right there, right? But knowing what we know now, war would have broken out anyway, because we're dealing with someone who's just insane. Right. So he had, to their response, he said this. He said, when you look at the 8 million people gone before time, and the 12 million maimed and disfigured, realize that there are no winners in war. We're all victims. And that, to me, was one of the most memorable that he was wrong in the assessment of how many people. We now know it's 10 million people, because they were counting the colonials, the Australians, the Indians, the South Africans, the Canadians, all the people part of the British Empire. So it was more, but that to me was definitely memorable. It's actually a quote on my Facebook page, and it's like, you really don't win anything. It's like saying someone won, even in the Civil War, we see that as a necessary thing, but you don't really win it when you see the catastrophe of it. So I think for me, that Neville Chamberlain paraphrase was definitely indelible in my mind, most memorable. And there's been others, of course, just can't remember them offhand. But I know I'm forgetting one that's really important. So yeah, right now we'll go with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think that's great that puts things full circle. Yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you, Dexter, for coming on the podcast and giving me your time and your insight. Yeah. It's been really interesting. I really like talking to you.
Cool, thanks. Maybe we could do it again sometime.
Yeah, no, absolutely.